A dense fog coils across the lampposts like a living factor, blurring the gaslights that sparkle with a susceptible, amber glow. The Thames glistens with a dark sheen, its floor damaged now and again through the creak of an oar or the splash of something unseen. The streets of London, grimy, cold, and stressed, stretch out in a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. It's dead night in the greatest metropolis of the sector, and although the factories have quieted and the shopkeepers have shut their doors, London could be very so much wide awake. The first impact of Victorian London at night is one among eerie contrast. For the duration of the day, the town bustles with noise, soot, and the unmistakable scent of coal smoke. But at night time, it alterations personality utterly. The clamour dies down, but so too does the experience of defence. Respectable families shutter their houses, policemen mild their lanterns, and the underbelly of the empire's capital starts off a valve to stir. This is the London that Charles Dickens hinted at, that Jack the Ripper haunted, and that numerous foggy legends have been born from. Metropolis cut up between elegance and menace, gaslight and gloom. The glow of gaslight with the aid of the mid-19th century. London had undergone a dramatic transformation. The introduction of gaslight revolutionized the way the city functioned after darkish. Before gaslight, dusk supposed close complete darkness. Shop for the flickering glow of oil lamps or candlelight in wealthier houses. Crime thrived, and most humans conveniently avoided going outside, except without doubt crucial, but with gaslight, matters modified slowly and unevenly. London was once among the many first cities on the earth to adopt gas illumination, with the primary gasoline-lit avenue showing in Pall Mall as early as 1807. Via the 1880s, gaslight had unfolded by means of the city-like veins, illuminating most important streets, public constructions, and storefronts. But despite this glow, much of London remained shrouded in shadow. The alleys of Whitechapel, the stairwells of tenement housing in dark, and the courts in the back of the Thames docks regularly lay in semi-darkness, and these had been the very areas where nighttime looked as if it would thrive. The glow of the gaslights was uneven and dim, their eerie, flickering, mild, barely reduce via the thick, industrial fogs that in most cases rolled in from the river, mingling with chimney smoke and horse dung. To type the notorious London targeted, a choking, yellowish miasma that made respiratory intricate and vision close to impossible. The gaslight could have lit the way in which, but it surely additionally exaggerated each shadow, every silhouette. To the average Londoner, going for walks below them alone could be a deeply unsettling expertise. Town breathes differently at night. Time during the Victorian period, the populace of London exploded. By means of 1851, town had come to be the biggest on the earth, with over 2.5 million residents. That number would close to double through the turn of the century. The result was a metropolis regularly on the threshold of cave-in, teetering between innovation and overcrowded chaos. At night, the strain shifted. Whilst the wealthy retreated to their stately properties and dependent parlours, the negative emerged onto the streets, in general on account that they had nowhere else to head. The casual poor, as they have been in most cases referred to as, lined up external workhouses, hoping for a spot to sleep. Others took refuge in doss houses, low-cost, more commonly disgusting lodgings that offered a rope to lean on instead of a mattress. Nonetheless, more determined corners in alleyways, huddling under their coats or newspaper sheets to fend off the nippiness. These souls have been part of the town's residing nighttime, drifting by means of the fog-like wraiths, scavenging, surviving, mostly stealing. The sounds of nighttime were exclusive to a far-off whistle from a patrolling constable, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones as a carriage rushed prior, the echo of footsteps that could just as effectively belong to a friend or a fiend. There was a stillness punctuated best by way of these hints of movement, tanned in that stillness. Fear as a rule took root. Policing the shadows, the Metropolitan Police, formed in 1829 by means of Sir Robert Peel, had by using the 1880s come to be an extra visible presence within the city, clad in dark blue uniforms and carrying simplest, a truncheon and a whistle. London's bobbies patrolled the streets at night time in hopes of deterring crime. But their job was once not easy. Many streets were nonetheless poorly lit or no longer lit in any respect. The fog might reduce visibility to mere toes, rendering a constable comfortably blind, and criminals have been rarely intimidated with the aid of a man with no firearm and no backup local. The Victorian criminal used to be daring, in most cases, desperate and quite conversant in slipping into the cracks of the city's underworld. Pickpockets, burglars, and con guys prowled the West End. Within the East Finish, things have been darker still. The Ripper murders of 1888 would shock the world. But even earlier than then, Whitechapel and Spitalfields had reputations for chance. Gangs dominated exact streets, and the lives of the terrible, especially women, were traditionally handled as disposable. For a lot of the nighttime used to be now not a time to sleep, but to survive. The Phantom and the actual Victorian London was once obsessed with the supernatural. Ghost studies, seances, and memories of monsters captivated the public imagination. Newspapers often released money owed of strange sightings in the fog, shadowy figures seen slipping through the alleys, or bizarre howls heard within the nighttime. One notorious figure was Spring-Heeled Jack, a supposed demon with fiery eyes, who would bounce over rooftops and assault passers-by. Though likely a blend of mass hysteria and pranksters, the reviews were believed they usually matched perfectly into a city, the place. The unknown was once continually just across the nook dot. Part of this notion got here from the bodily fact of London itself. The fog obscured faces and muffled sounds. A character might be walking alone and suddenly find themselves head-to-head with a further friend or stranger, benign or damaging. Gaslight forged long, moving shadows, enjoying tips on the eyes. The boundary between the actual and imagined used to be skinny, and this wasn't simply in the slums. Residents of even the wealthiest boroughs commonly claimed to listen to scratching at their home windows or footsteps on their staircases when no person should be there. Fear in this city used to be democratic. Night staff and creatures of the dark no longer all people feared the nighttime. For some, it was once their time to earn a dwelling. Night soil. Men amassed human waste earlier than daybreak. Road sweepers did their work in the shadows. Deliveries had been made at the oddest hours, notably to hinder the bustle of daylight. Hours, visitors, prostitutes, musicians, chimney boys, and gamblers all lived via the rhythm of the town's twilight. Then there were the journalists, nighttime watchmen, and gravediggers, individuals whose jobs positioned them immediately within the root of the unusual, the quiet, and the unsafe. Doctors too were oftentimes known as out within the small hours, summoned to treat sufferers in freezing tenements with nothing greater than a flickering candle and the hope they would not be robbed or worse. On the way there, animals have been a constant presence at nighttime. Rats, cats, puppies, some feral, others loyal to nobody. Horses, too, persevered their labor, pulling cabs and cargo via town while their drivers nodded sleepily or shouted curses into the mist. Conclusion. The heartbeat below the fog. Victorian London at nighttime was now not a single expert. Was once many things to many humans. It was beauty and terror, progress and decay. It used to be the rhythmic pulse of hooves echoing via gaslit streets, the quiet weeping of a widow in a boarding condominium, the flash of a blade in a darkened court docket, the snort of a under the influence of alcohol rolling out of a tavern. It used to be the scent of bread baking at daybreak, and the stink of the Thames at low tide. It was once a metropolis alive, after dark. This chapter is handist, the beginning, as we enterprise deeper into the lives of people who inhabited Victorian London's midnight hours. We'll find the stories that lurk just past the lamplight, the place history and fantasy collide, and the fog on no account real lifts. If the guts of Victorian London beat in Westminster and the West End, then its uneasy sense of right and wrong stirred within the East. The East Finish of London was a landscape of contradiction. Here, amid the docks, rail yards, and the Grand Empire printed its frailest and most afflicted soul. By day, it was a maze of labor, complication, and exhaustion. Through night, it grew to be anything else more primal, more secretive, more dangerous. To stroll the streets of Whitechapel, Bethnal inexperienced, or Spitalfields after sundown was to step into an international governed with the aid of shadows, desperation, and the sluggish burning worry of what waited in the fog. This chapter explores that world in intimate element, peeling again the layers of fantasy and filth to disclose the lived truth of the East. Finish after darkish eye. A metropolis inside a metropolis. London used to be under no circumstances a unified entire. Was once a patchwork of monetary, social, and cultural fragments. The East Finish used to be essentially the most vivid reminder of this fractured identity, located simply past the glimmering palaces, Parliament buildings, and gents' clubs of the West. It was once just a few miles in distance, but seemingly centuries away in fortune. The East End's populace exploded within the 19th century. Irish immigrants fleeing famine, Japanese European Jews escaping persecution, and rural English migrants chasing factory work all poured into these narrow, overbuilt streets. Via the 1880s, some areas of the East End had populous densities over 800 men and women per acre. In Rookery's densely packed slums, the living stipulations were among the many worst in Europe. At night time, the East End became a location where survival instincts sharpened. Food was scarce, work used to be unsure, and crime used to be an ever-gift threat. Legit citizens avoided it completely after darkish. Policemen patrolled in pairs, if in any respect. The streets teemed with persons, but the risk wasn't simply of their numbers, it used to be of their invisibility. 2. Tenements, lodging houses, and rookeries. Housing within the East End defied even the most generous definitions of safe haven. Whole families ordinarily lived in a single room, repeatedly sharing space with strangers. Walls had been thin, windows had been small or non-existent, and sanitation was nearly absent. At night time, these overcrowded areas stifled those inside, forcing the stressed and the homeless back out into the streets. Lodging houses provided a transitory reprieve. For a few pence, one would cozy a spot on a straw-stuffed mat. In more cost-effective options, sleep upright at the same time slung over a rope. These were called fourpenny coffins or twopenny hangovers, and so they served as the last stop earlier than utter vagrancy. In lodging houses, 1,000s of the city's forgotten mingled. Thieves and beggars, widows and orphans, night time staff and drifters. The night echoed with coughing, muttering, and moaning. Bodies pressed close collectively now, not for alleviation, but for warmness. External, within the alleyways at the back of these constructions, rats foraged alongside cats, and drunken figures stumbled into doorways, hoping to prevent the concentration of constables or predators. III. Whitechapel, the title that modified the whole thing. The poverty and crime troubled the complete East Finish. No district has turned out to be as synonymous with nightmarish worry as Whitechapel. In 1888, Whitechapel was once house to one of the most impoverished and overcrowded streets in the empire. Nevertheless, it wasn't simply squalor that haunted its lanes. That 12 months, an unidentified killer started a spree of murders that would terrorize the population and cement the East End within the collective imagination as a situation of horror. Jack the Ripper's reign of terror lasted from August to November 1888, for the period of which, as a minimum 5 women, all negative, all identified to sleep rough or in lodging residencies, have been brutally murdered. The killings took place below the quilt of night, often in semi-public locations. The killer vanished into the fog each time, leaving at the back of mutilated bodies and mounting hysteria. The streets of Whitechapel, already shrouded in suspicion, now seethed with paranoia. Every stranger was a suspect. Every footstep was feared. Men avoided eye contact. Females feared walking by myself. Constables were stretched skinny, and their whistles regularly came too late. Gaslight did little to deter evil. Actually, the killer may have used it to navigate, concentrating on victims, simply on the fringes of visibility, just past help.iv, night work, and determined livelihoods despite its risks. The East End was alive with nocturnal labor. Work rarely stopped easily, considering the fact that the sun had set. Instead, it shifted form. Docks operated into the nighttime, loading and unloading cargo by lamplight. In the markets of Petticoat Lane and Spitalfields, stall owners quite often prepared for morning revenue good before sunrise. Bakers, printers, and brewers lit their fires and kettles before daybreak. But there was once also one other type of work, darker, more desperate. Females turned to prostitution in excellent numbers. Estimates suggest over 60,000 prostitutes operated in Victorian London at the top of the century, many targeted within the East End. These were not the glamorous courtesans of literature, however, impoverished females replacing a few pennies for food or shelter. They labored in alleys, beneath railway arches, behind pubs. Their consumers had been as assorted as their fate sailors, clerks, employees, and, on occasion, predators some distance worse. Youngster labor was once just as generic. Chimney sweeps, errand boys, and in-shape girls labored earlier than and after school hours in the event that they went to tuition in any respect. The nights have been notably brutal during iciness, when youngsters were dispatched to promote flowers, matches, or newspapers in the freezing fog. The soundscape of worry night time in the East End was not often quiet. The clang of forge hammers, the wail of a child, the distant rattle of a cartwheel, the shrill song of a drunkard, or the cry of a girl in misery. These sounds wove collectively into a type of nighttime song, chaotic, desperate, mournful. Within the silence between sounds, creativeness did its cruelest work. Used to be that a scream or a cat, was once that a shadow or a person waiting to strike. The East finishes night, terrified even those who had lived inside it their whole lives. Superstition and faith mixed without difficulty here. Some believed in curses or evil spirits that walked Whitechapel Street. Others, extra-rational, believed in the evil that men do specifically when cloaked in anonymity and fog. The police have been typically mistrusted, and with good purpose. Many officers had been underpaid, overworked, and usually corrupt. Justice was inconsistent. The bad had little recourse if wronged, and even much less safeguard if they became targets. Docks, drink, and decay. The proximity of the East End to the London docks made it a hotbed of vice and smuggling. Foreign sailors disembarked via the 1000s, bringing with them no longer just alternate, but tales, contraband, and ailment. Dockside pubs overflowed at night time. Rum, gin, and low-cost ale numbed many a hungry stomach. Gin palaces sparkled like beacons, delivering momentary warmness and forgetfulness in exchange for a number of coins. Their interiors were wonderful mirrors, lamps, polished brass. However, outside, fights mostly broke out, and drunken bodies slumped in gutters. Opium dens, though much less fashioned than well-known fiction suggests, did exist in Limehouse and Stepney. Here, the weary and the wretched got here to dream away their ache. Writers like Arthur Conan Doyle and journalists of the day, as a rule, exaggerated their presence. However, their mystique brought to the general sense that the East Finish was a location where the foundations didn't observe them. The place. Darkness reigned. VII. The birthplace of social reform, regardless of its nightmarish conditions. The East Finish was also the cradle of reform. The appalling nighttime realities stimulated one of the most earliest social employees, journalists and campaigners. Henry Mayhew's interviews with beggars and avenue children stunned Victorian readers. The Salvation Navy began in the East End, offering non-secular steerage, ingredients, and a mattress for the destitute. Social reformers walked the identical streets as criminals and vagrants, most commonly at night. They documented what they noticed. Children sound asleep in gutters, females selling themselves to outlive, households ravenous in unheated rooms. These deaths eventually spurred policy changes, though now not quick, ample for individuals who wanted support most. Conclusion: no peace for the East. Night time, on no account real, ended for the East Finish. At the same time as the sun rose, it left behind, exhausted our bodies, emptied gin bottles, and the lingering dread of what darkness could bring subsequent time. The East Finish was a city of survivors, men and women who worked, wept, fought, and continued underneath stipulations few in contemporary cities can assume. To understand the soul of Victorian London at night time, one need to first realize the East Finish. It was once the city's secret stored in plain sight, and the situation where gaslights barely pierced the fog. Now, not all shadows in Victorian London concealed horror. Some draped themselves in velvet, whispered via lace curtains, and echoed off polished marble. Welcome to the West Finish after dark. The place gaslight shimmered on silk gowns and whispers. In drawing rooms hid their possessed kind of hazard. The West Finish, with its grand theatres, gents' clubs, high-end, searching arcades, and elite drawing rooms, used to be the beating heart of Victorian high society. While the East End laboured in soot and worry, the West End strolled beneath the same gaslight with practised grace. However, for all its magnificence and refinement, the West Finish used to be no longer proof against the tensions of the age. It was the stage on which the Empire displayed its glittering masquerade that most often slipped after darkish. This chapter leads us by means of the sparkling streets and salons of London's Western Quarter. The place wealth bought privilege, but not perpetually peace. The district of golds and drama, the West Finish, wasn't easily a position. It was once a performance. By way of day, it used to be the retain of politicians, aristocrats, artists, and bankers. But it used to be at night time that it came to existence in full spectacle. Horse-drawn carriages trundled down Regent Avenue and the Strand, their lanterns flickering like fireflies. Women in silk descended from carriages to attend the opera, while gents adjusted their top hats before entering smoke-crammed clubs. Theatres akin to Drury Lane, the Adelphi and the Lyceum drew massive crowds every evening. Gaslighting inside the theatres created a magical settings, spotlighting the actors in golden colorations whilst leaving the gang in partial darkness. It was a time when Shakespeare shared the stage with melodrama, and illusion reigned supreme. External, road performers and carriers delivered their possessed show, selling roasted chestnuts, suits, or evening variations of scandal sheets. But the West End was extra than simply showbiz. It was where the British elite declared their dominance over now not simply the town, however the world. This used to be where empire, wealth, and fashion converged. 2. Gaslight's glow, romance or phantasm. Gaslight, in the West End, used to be a different expertise than within the East. It decorated Pall Mall with golden arches of light and gave Piccadilly Circus an otherworldly sheen. Outside theatres and restaurants, fuel jets hissed in rhythm, lending warmness to the wintry weather air and sparkle to the evening mist. Retail outlets expanded their hours, utilizing gaslight to show off imported fabrics, best hats, or the modern day in industrial novelties. The light used to be flattering. It softened wrinkles, made colors richer, and blurred imperfections. Courtship regularly performed out under these flickering lamps. A look across a road, a meeting at a park's facet, a chaperoned walk after an evening on the Royal Albert Hall. However, for all its romance, gaslight was once also a deception. It obscured more than it published. Behind its golden hue, many secrets thrived. Affairs, transactions, secrets whispered in alleyways or in the back of purple curtain parlors. The gaslight grew to become downright into a sequence of tableaux. It's attractive, and each probably false. 3. Lifestyles in the back of the curtains. The grand houses of Mayfair and Belgravia sparkled with chandeliers and warm hearths, but additionally they pulsed with tensions hardly ever seen from the road. At night, as soon as the servants had cleared supper and drawn the curtains, the drawing room grew to become the stage for the domestic rituals of the higher type. Music, poetry, readings, and political debates handed the hours. For many higher category ladies, the night was their principal second of social performance. Dressed in the present-day Paris fashions, they performed piano, hosted salons, or with ease seemed in the correct places to hold their status. However, these drawing rooms also housed darker realities, marriages of convenience, repressed emotion, hidden illnesses, and the bloodless equipment of aristocratic obligation. Servants probably bore witness to their employers' secrets. A hushed argument, a slurred insult, the rustle of any individual slipping quietly out the back door. Not all domestic drama required the stage of Drury Lane, and whilst some residents dozed underneath thick wool blankets, others stayed up studying Charles Dickens or Wilkie Collins novels that generally mirrored their very lives, revealing the unease that simmered below the polished surface. 4. Gents' clubs and middle of the night. Politics. London's gentlemen's clubs had been the dead night's sanctuaries of energy. White's, Brooks's, the Athenaeum, and the Reform Club had been among the many most prestigious. Entry was once reserved for the elite landed men, parliamentarians, high-rating navy officers, and industrialists. These golf equipment had been havens of brandy, cigars, leather armchairs, and exclusivity. Right here, the real decisions of the empire were commonly made, not in Parliament, but in low-lit lounges after middle of the night. Deals struck over port, scandals quietly, buried wagers positioned on politics, races, and women. These spaces had been quiet, but under no circumstances nonetheless, their silence overlaying a roar of have an effect on. Despite the grandeur, they could even be locations of deep loneliness. Many individuals lived just about their complete lives in these clubs, reduced off from household, engaged best with fellow bachelors or widowers. For them, the club's lamps had been their fireplace, its staff, their family. Now, not some distance from these confidential haunts have been gambling, residences, card rooms, and more discreet organizations that blurred the line between membership and brothel-catouring to people who wanted no longer just power and relief. However, breakout night work for the wealthy even in essentially the most stylish quarters. The town's machinery needed tending. The footmen, maids, butlers, and cooks who served within the grand houses of the West End lived by nighttime, rising before daybreak and retiring after middle of the night. Their world intersected with their master's simplest and brief, orchestrated moments. For a scullery maid, the night probably spent scrubbing pots in silence, a valet perhaps on name. To guide a gentleman strolling back from the theatre, a housekeeper would oversee all, ensuring no fireplace went out and no theft came about. The nighttime belonged to them, but it provided no relaxation. Street sweepers passed silently through. Gros penor, rectangular. Night soil men accrued waste with as little noise as viable. Policemen patrolled Hyde Park, cautious of no longer handiest thieves, however, the occasional nobleman who had wandered out too far in his cups. And all around them, in lamplit bedrooms and curtained carriages, secrets swirled like the ever-present mist. Vice in velvetespite, its magnificence. The West Finish had its share of vice. One of the most metropolis's most discreet and pricey brothels were hidden in its quietest corners, catering exclusively to the elite. These enterprises operated with close to theatrical discretion. Clients arrived beneath assumed names. Employees were paid not just for their magnificence, however, for his or her silence. There were additionally scandals, by and large, buried by using have an impact on. A viscount with a taste for opium. A baby kisser found out in a compromising crisis. Blackmail used to be no longer distinguished. Gossip traveled fast, though it not often reached the newspapers until, of direction, any individual wanted it to. This world of elite vice was invisible to the informal observer, but for the doorman, cabbies, and night porters, it used to be just a part of the job. They knew the names, they noticed the faces, and they kept quiet. 7. When danger visited the drawing room, the West Finish was now not immune to violence. Though crime rates had been lessened than within the East, they were not non-existent. Jewel thefts, confidence schemes, and infrequent but stunning murders disturbed the illusion of safeguard. In 1876, the mysterious murder of Lord Frederick Cavendish at Phoenix Park shook the upper courses. The inspiration that anyone of rank could be attacked in huge daylight hours, let alone in the useless of night, sent a ripple of fear by means of the West Finish. Carriages had been ordered to travel with bigger velocity. Police presence improved. Exclusive guards had been hired. For some, the inspiration of an interloper, terrible crook, probably even foreign, invading the sanctity of a Mayfair house, used to be a nightmare rooted in class anxiousness. Performs and novels of the time normally explored this theme. The drawing room invaded by way of threat. The night, finally, performed no favorites. Conclusion. Gilded nights. Gilded fears. The West Finish at night was once an opera of its own, grand, glittering, and full of secrets and techniques. Its lights dazzled, its voices sang, and its power moved silently through marble halls. But under the glamour lay the identical fears that haunted all of London. The fog didn't discriminate. The shadows crept into each quarter, and even within the best drawing room, one might hear the far-off cry of the city's darker soul. 2. Appreciate Victorian London's nighttime. One need to walk both its slums and its salons. 4. Underneath each gaslight, whether flickering over cobblestones or shining through stained glass, there was at all times something unseen waiting. It was once, not in basic terms whether it was anything more, a creeping force that converted the familiar into the terrifying. London's fog was not a passive mist, but an lively, practically mindful presence. It swallowed street lamps, twisted alleyways, and cloaked every horror in its damp breath. This used to be no normal fog. This was the London precise. In the daylight hours, it lingered like a nuisance. At night, it ruled like a tyrant. The fog of Victorian London used to be a defining aspect of town's identity, greater than any, constructing, greater than any man. It blurred the strains between safeguard and peril, between civilization and barren region, and it used to be perpetually watching. In this chapter, we step into the fog itself. Now, not only to realize, however to breathe it, to comprehend how it shaped the city, its fears, its tradition, and its folks. The making of a monster. The fog that enveloped London in the 19th century was not just common mist. It was once a lethal cocktail of moisture, soot, smoke, and chemical substances born from coal, factories, fires, and filth, identified colloquially as pea-soupers or London particulars. These thick yellow-brown fogs have been infamous internationally. Through the 1850s, London had become the biggest coal-burning city on this planet. Nearly each home, keep, and public construction used coal for warmness and cooking. Factories belched smoke without limit. Enormous quantities of chimneys coughed soot into the air day and night. And the town's low-lying geography, nestled alongside the gradual, polluted Thames, created an excellent trap for this airborne poison. When cold, damp air moved in from the nation-state and blended with London's industrial output, the outcomes was once catastrophic. Visibility dropped to near zero, respiratory became painful, and men and women mainly died. In the worst episodes, often called exceptional fogs, the town quite simply ceased to operate. But even on traditional nights, the fog used to be a steady, creeping chance. 2. Living throughout the fogimagine, stepping out into a road, the place your own hand is barely seen earlier than your face. Lamps glow as blurred orbs, figures appear and vanish like ghosts. The fog clings to your epidermis and garments, will get into your mouth, and settles in your lungs with every breath. It changes how sound travels, muffling some noises and amplifying others in strange, unnatural methods. To stroll town at night in thick fog was to enter yet another world. Carriages crashed. Persons lost their approach and wandered for hours. Criminals disappeared into it like magicians. There are documents of guys falling into the Thames from piers they couldn't see, of females strolling straight into partitions they idea were alleyways. Fog didn't simply obscure it, harassed. Acquainted landmarks vanished. Gaslight twisted into shadows. Even constables lost their manner on patrol. One policeman in 1880 reportedly became disoriented in Kensington Gardens in the course of a fog so thick he needed to shout, except a fellow officer discovered him through sound on my own. It was not unusual for folks to sleep at their offices or in public constructions when you consider that they couldn't find their houses. 3. Crime's great. Fog used to be the greatest partner crime ever had. In a metropolis already stricken by pickpockets, thieves, and worse, it provided anonymity without an effort. The Ripper could have struck on clear nights. However, the surroundings of dread surrounding his killings used to be thick with imagined fog. In poorer neighborhoods, the fog used to be traditionally extra-centered, as a result of the density of coal usage and shortage of ventilation. Gangs used it to their potential. So did burglars. So did murderers. And on account that police had no radios, no cars, and restricted verbal exchange, a foggy night intended a surge in lawlessness. Visibility for watchmen would be as little as 1 yard. A thief could snatch a pocketbook and vanish with no trace. Even in the core of a crowd, women were exceptionally prone. Assaults rose sharply in the course of fog episodes. However, more than physical crime, the fog invited psychological terror. Persons feared what they could not see. They hesitated at corners. They kept away from alleyways. They jumped at footsteps at the back of them. The fog whispered things the town dared not say aloud. 4. The fog in literature and imagination. London's fog was once now not only a bodily hazard, it grew to become an emblem. It loomed tremendous within the Victorian creativeness, turning up in novels, performs, poems, and artwork. Charles Dickens, lower back time and again to the motif of fog in works like Bleak Apartment, where it turns into a metaphor for the ethical confusion and suffocating forms of the city. Fog far and wide. Fog up the river, where it flows among green aits and meadows. Fog down the river, the place it rolls defiled among the many tiers of delivery. Fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of a shivering little prentice boy on responsibility. At his grasp's door, Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stalked criminals through fog-thick alleys. Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde conjured fog as the veil between civility and savagery. The fog used to be the ideal metaphor for Victorian anxiety, that under the skin of empire and order, chaos and horror lurked. Painters, too, embraced the fog. J.M.W. Turner's misty canvases, Whistler's nocturnes, all captured a metropolis, forever on the verge of disappearing into itself. Even youngsters' reviews were shaped by the fog. In lots of Victorian nursery rhymes, unhealthy climate was once linked with punishment, fear, and matters that went bump within the nighttime. dying within the air. The fog wasn't just a temper, it was a killer. Within the worst events, hundreds died in a single week. For the period of the pleasant fog of 1873, for example, over 270 humans died instantly from respiratory failure. The winter of 1879 was once worse. In just a few days, over 1,100 deaths were recorded beyond seasonal expectations, and in 1880, 1,000s fell in poor health with what newspapers referred to as fog poisoning. Children and the elderly had been peculiarly susceptible. Many died in their beds as coal fumes crept by way of cracked window panes. Hospitals overflowed, colleges closed, factories halted production. The city, fairly literally, choked on its possessed breath. Animals suffered too. Horses died in droves from lung complications. Puppies wandered off, and certainly not again. Birds vanished. The fog killed indiscriminately, but it used to be tolerated, accepted, as a part of London existence. Like rain or traffic, some reformers tried to deal with the pollution, but they have been as a rule omitted. Coal was once to foremost, and development to money-making. It might no longer be, except the 20th century, that serious air-pleasant reform commenced. Until then, the fog remained a consistent, creeping presence, like loss of life's breath, on the back of the city's neck. Everyday existence underneath the Dampfer. A lot of Londoners, fog used to be effortlessly part of existence. Children realized to navigate through it with uncanny ease. Fanatics met in fog-drenched parks and kissed in silence. Staff stumbled via it, coughing but undeterred. Milkmaids tied bells to their carts. Educate stations issued lanterns to porters. Even fog-certain etiquette emerged, guys doffing hats to invisible ladies, voices asserting themselves round corners. And yet, there used to be normally an edge of worry. Households locked their doors tighter on foggy nights. Females hurried their steps. Experiences abounded of unusual creatures obvious in the mist: phantoms, demons, murderers. Whether or not these stories had been actual or no longer, the worry was once. Some even discovered an unusual romance in the fog. Writers, painters, and dreamers noticed it now, not as a threat, however, as a veil in the back of which one more world waited. A cleaner one, a freer one, or might be only one. The place-town's dirt was once much less noticeable. Mort, VII. The fog's cultural legacy. The legacy of the London fog is greater than only a historical curiosity, it's a cultural icon. The archetypal snapshot of Victorian London is inseparable from its murky shroud. Gaslights glowing through mist, prime hats and capes silhouetted towards yellow clouds, the eerie whistle of a constable fading into nothing. Hollywood and TV have embraced this imagery. Every adaptation of Oliver Twist, Sherlock Holmes, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde aspects it. The fog is the first persona on reveal reward, earlier than the hero, earlier than the villain, before the plot itself. Even at present, the suggestion of London fog endures in art, trend, and metaphor. It represents mystery, risk, and the unknown. However, it also reminds us of the price of unchecked progress, of the rate paid in lungs and lives to gasoline and empire. Conclusion: the unseen king of the night within. The annals of Victorian London's night. No determined looms, larger nor extra invisibly than the fog. It was no longer simply backdrop, but a personality in its possess proper, a drive, a temper, a menace. It united rich and poor, crook and constable, in shared helplessness, and although it certainly not spoke, it told the town the whole lot. It needed to grasp that growth has a price, that beauty hides hazard, that even within the brightest gaslight, something can be misplaced, that frequently, essentially the most terrifying factor is what which you couldn't see. The fog nonetheless rolls in, even now, not in climate, then in reminiscence. When the town slept, or at least pretended to, the watchman walked, lantern in one hand, truncheon within the other. They moved through the fog and dust, by way of alleyways and across cobbled streets, standing as the last skinny line between order and chaos. However, what did it particularly imply to be a guardian of the night in Victorian London? To realize the pulse of Victorian London after sundown, one have to stroll beside people who have been sworn to protect it. The nighttime was once their territory, though it furnished no appreciate, no guarantee of protection, and obviously no silence. In this chapter, we slip into the long blue coat of the constable. Mild hour lantern, and patrol the ever-darkening city. The start of the Metropolitan Police era. Then 1829. Policing in London was once an uneven patchwork. There were watchmen, parish constables, and thief-takers, customarily as corrupt or incompetent as the criminals they pursued. It was once a system developed more on regional familiarity and bribes than on justice. That converted with the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829, introduced through then-resident Secretary Sir Robert Peel. This force, the bobbies or peelers, as they came to be known, were supposed to be a legitimate, disciplined causa civil substitute to a standing army, dressed in blue uniforms, to distinguish them from soldiers who wore crimson. The new constables carried most effective a truncheon and a whistle. No gun, no sword. They have been, to be polite however, corporation. Visible, however restrained. Their job was to hinder crime by way of presence. Now not necessarily to chase or arrest criminals after the fact. By using the mid-19th century, the Metropolitan Police had grown vastly, but its attain and resources were still stretched thin, especially at night. A constable's night shift began with muster ordinarily at some of the metropolis's police stations, where sergeants would assign beats and inspect uniforms. Each and every constable used to be anticipated to patrol a precise discipline, on my own and on foot, for hours at a time, rain, wind, or fog however, armed best with a wooden baton, a whistle, and oftentimes a bullseye lantern, a metal lamp, with a rotating shutter to focus or cover the beam. The constable's duties included checking that retailer doorways and home windows were secured, stopping or responding to brawls, pickpocketing, and public drunkenness, relocating on loiterers or vagrants, offering assistance to misplaced residents or those in distress, reporting fires, suspicious behavior, or unexplained deaths. They had been anticipated to be incorruptible, silent, and relentless, but many had been something however. A metropolis that resisted order. Victorian London didn't welcome authority with open palms, especially now not from men in uniform. In bad neighborhoods, the police have been obvious as retailers of oppression. They enforced vagrancy legal guidelines, broke up strikes, and became a blind eye to the abuses of the rich. Officers jogging beats in Whitechapel, Limehouse, or inexperienced most commonly did so at satisfactory individual danger. They were spat upon, insulted, and generally attacked. Some locals noticed them as nuisances, others as enemies. The connection was fraught, especially at night time, when tempers flared and alcohol flowed. Even in wealthier districts, constables were regarded as critical, however unwelcome presences. To the upper category, they have been servants anticipated to defer, now not to question. To the crook type, they had been marks to be evaded, mocked, or manipulated. For each sincere constable, there had been others who took bribes, disregarded crimes, or abused their function. Self-discipline within the drive used to be strict. However, inner corruption used to be an open secret. The instruments of the night. Timur, Victorian constable's fundamental weapon wasn't his truncheon, it was once his presence. Visibility was the cornerstone of 19th century policing. Without difficulty, being obvious was purported to discourage crime. To this finish, constables had been required to keep 2 average routes and avoid resting during their shift. Even though exhausted, their whistle, particular and piercing, was once used to summon support. If blown, it was once anticipated that fellow constables would come going for walks. However, in a fog-choked alley, help might be blocks and minutes away. In reality, many officers knew they had been by myself. Their lanterns have been each tools and traps. The flicker of light gave them some visibility, but also made them ambitions. Some officers learned to stroll with the sunshine blanketed, revealing it handest when necessary. Others trusted extra in sound listening for footfalls, whispers, or the scrape of a knife on brick. They stored notebooks, logging the whole lot from damaged home windows to suspicious people. These have been reviewed daily by superiors and might make or ruin a constable's career. Crime. Underneath the cloak of darkness, night crime was once, most of the time, more vicious and more determined than what occurred for the period of daylight. With fewer witnesses, criminals felt emboldened. Fights grew to become lethal. Robberies escalated to assaults. Drunken squabbles grew to become riots. Muggings had been common, mainly near pubs, theatres, and boarding residences. Prostitution introduced with it no longer handled ethical panic, however. Real violence, pimps, jealous consumers, and predatory gangs. In wealthier neighborhoods, burglars used the cover of darkness to climb fences and slip by way of home windows. Housebreakers commonly labored in pairs, one within the opposite, staring at 4 patrols. A missed beat or inattentive constable would lead to a mansion being cleaned out in an hour. Homicide was rarer. However, when it happened, it was once quite often brutal. Jack the Ripper was once probably the most infamous, but he was once not by myself. Dozens of murders passed off in Victorian London that got no public outcry, largely on account that the victims had been poor, feminine, or overseas. Officers investigating these scenes did so without forensics, without proper training, and most of the time without backup. They relied on instinct, experience, and luck. Vi. The Night Watchman versus the Bobino. Not all middle-of-the-night safety fell to the police. Many buildings, notably warehouses, factories, and confidential estates, employed night watchmen. These guys had been most likely veterans, elderly workers, or these too infirm for ordinary work. They patrolled small territories, generally carrying a bell, cudgel, and lantern. Watchmen were frequently revered, however probably mocked. Many were known to sleep for the duration of shifts. Their status used to be so unhealthy within the early 1800s that it helped justify the formation of the authentic police force. Still, they endured, even into the late 19th century. Their presence commonly seen bundled in greatcoats by a fireplace or going for walks. The equal tightroute for many years added to the feel of London's nighttime. They knew every creak of the structures, each trickle of water, every rat nest. Some took nice pride in their work. Others, without difficulty, persevered it, amassing their pittance and hoping the fog stayed mild and the streets stayed quiet. Females and the police at nighttime. Ladies in Victorian London have been largely excluded from formal policing roles, except the very finish of the century. However, they had been deeply entangled with the police's nighttime obligations as victims, suspects, informants, and distractions. Prostitutes were in most cases arrested or fined for solicitation, loitering, or public nuisance, chiefly at nighttime, but some constables relied on them for understanding. Ladies who labored the streets knew who carried knives, who ran unlawful playing dens, who had vanished final week and hadn't returned. Centre and higher class ladies, when caught external after dark, most often invoked suspicion. Why was she strolling by myself? Was once she fleeing anything? Used to be she a hazard? And home servants, traditionally the final to sleep and the primary to rise, in many instances learned crimes earlier than anyone else. The blood on the step, the body within the alley, the back door left open. For the constable, a girl at night might be something: a witness, a liar, a secret agent, a sufferer, a corpse. VIII. What the constables fared not. Every constable used to be brave. Most weren't heroes. They had been worn out, underpaid men with households of their possess and very little security. They feared the fog. They feared drunks. They feared knives in the dead of night. But more than anything, they feared invisibility. To disappear to your beat was once to vanish into the indifference of the town. Many officers have been injured and even killed in the line of responsibility with little fanfare. The uniform could carry authority, but it surely did not deliver immortality. The night blurred identities. A person in uniform might be flawed for a goal, or a corpse, and they also walked hour after hour, road after avenue, hands on truncheon, ears alert to every whisper and footfall. Conclusion: the sound of a whistle in the fog. They weren't saints, they weren't saviors. However, they had been there, night after night time, a thin blue thread winding via a metropolis that didn't understand peace when all else was once silent, and the fog rolled thick, and the criminals emerged from the shadows. The constable's whistle was once town's heartbeat, a lonely sound echoing via gaslit alleys, reminding London that someone used to be staring at it, that someone cared, nonetheless imperfectly. The streets of Victorian London by no means slept, no longer relatively lengthy after retail outlets closed and shutters slammed shut. Town's arteries still throbbed with action. Horses' hooves clicked over cobblestones, iron-rimmed wheels scraped by way of sludge, and excessive atop his driver's perch. The cabman reigned over the nocturnal tide, watchful, weary. and climate-overwhelmed. He used to be greater than only a driver. He was once a lifeline, a witness, a guardian, and now and again, a conspirator. This chapter rides beside him by means of fog-thick lanes, past sound-asleep tenements, past flickering gaslights, into the breathless tension of a metropolis, ceaselessly caught between movement and threat. The horse-drawn lifeblood of the night before automobiles and electric trams. London at night moved on hooves and wheels. Cabs and carriages dominated the thoroughfares, connecting each category, every errand, each secret. There were two main varieties of horse-drawn cabs. The hansom cab, a quick, lightweight, two-wheeled carriage, perfect for one or two passengers, standard with gentlemen heading to golf equipment or romantic liaisons. The growler, a four-wheeled cab, best for heavier masses and households, generally pushed by using guys with thicker coats and quieter mouths. Both varieties crammed the streets at night time, ferrying shoppers to theatres, pubs, lodges, brothels, properties, police stations and, occasionally, into risk. Whilst many daylight hours carriages were privately owned or run by rich households, dead nightside visitors belonged to the cabman. He was the road's confidant and courier.ii. The cabman's station and waiting sport at night. Cabmen waited, in line, in silence, rain dripping from hat brims, fog curling round their boots. They stood at exact cab, ranks official ready spots, external theatres, train stations, and public squares, at Covent Backyard, at Charing Go, at King's Pass. They waited for the next fare. Their horses nickered and stamped, their lamps sputtered, and the cabmen, some slouched, some alert, watched town unfold. Usually, there could be no consumer for hours. Other instances, there could be a surprising surgence pouring out of songhalls, women screaming from disturbances, policemen wanting experience to against-the-law scene. Cabmen learned to be patient. However, in addition, they discovered to pay attention. Each conversation, each argument on the curb, every whispered address. These guys knew who was dishonest on who paid in gold, who ran without paying, who wept in silence as they stepped. Within, they have been the keepers of 1,000 secrets and techniques, most of which they never informed. 3. The night's diversified passengers. The hour of darkness. Cab clients used to be a kaleidoscope of Victorian existence. Rich and negative, inebriated and sober, harmless and guilty, all needed transport. Gentlemen in night costume, heading to golf equipment, mistresses, or card games, actresses and performers, some wrapped in furs, others shivering in costumes as they hurried to after-parties, nurses or midwives, summoned urgently to deal with scribbled in haste, policemen, dragging suspects or corpses, doctors, responding to fever, childbirth, or demise, women of the night, using the cab for discretion or for security, pickpockets and con artists, blending in, paying with attraction or counterfeit coin. A single shift would carry a cabman across the social spectrum. However, he seldom judged. The money was once the same. Whether or not it got here from an earl's hand or a thief's, nonetheless, Hazard most often rode within the again seat. Some passengers had been violent, others ran without paying, some fell asleep, inebriated or unconscious, forcing the cabman to come to a decision whether to wake them or rob them. Most didn't, however, some did. 4. The horse's role within the nighttime. Cabman mostly had just one actual associate, the horse. Horses knew the routes, as good as their drivers. They would advise of the cab in blinding fog when their masters would see nothing. Some have been skittish, some brave, some ornery, others loyal to the point of forestalling when they felt their driver hunch, unconscious or lifeless. At night, these animals braved horrible stipulations, easy roads, slippery cobblestones, smoke-filled alleys, and sudden terrors. They had been more commonly overworked, underfed, and mistreated, and yet they persisted. Some drivers dealt with their horses better than their own households, others whipped them mercilessly. But irrespective of how they were handled, these horses had been vital to the city's rhythm. Without them, the cab stopped, and so did the story. Cabmen, as witnesses to crime and panic. Few professions positioned a person closer to the pulse of urban drama than that of the Victorian cabman. Their cabs grew to become cellular confessionals, emergency transports, crime scenes, and regularly, the final trip of the quickly to be dead. When Jack the Ripper terrorized Whitechapel in 1888, cabmen had been drawn into the hysteria. Females begged for rides, even once they couldn't pay. Others claimed to have pushed guys matching the Ripper's indistinct description. Some cadman, hoping for reward or cognizance, supplied dubious suggestions to the police. None resulted in arrests. On the course of murders, robberies, and fires, cabmen were normally the first on the scene. They transported constables, carried bleeding victims, hauled witnesses. On a couple of celebration, they discovered our bodies themselves. Dead varieties slumped in alleys, sprawled near gutters, or dumped unceremoniously behind cargo yards. And yet, when known as to present statements, many hesitated. Why? Considering the fact that they had noticeable what happened to witnesses, that they had seen reprisals, and they knew that town rarely thanked a person for telling the reality.vi. Dangers of the Jabbe cabman's risks got here from every path. Under the influence of alcohol or violent passengers, some lashed out without warning. Others tried to rob the motive force at knife point. Thieves, in particular within the East End. Drivers have been usually ambushed by way of gangs who wanted the horse, the cab, or just the money box. Rogue cabs, unlawful drivers without licenses undercut legitimate staff. Some operated as fronts for prostitution or fencing stolen goods. Sickness. Drivers typically caught illnesses from their passengers: tuberculosis, cholera, influenza. Climate. Many froze of their seats for the period of bitter winters. Others collapsed from warmness, exhaustion in summer. Accidents, slippery streets, spooked horses, broken wheels. A fall from the cab would be fatal. And yet, thousands of guys lined up each day for a license, considering that even threat was once most efficient to hunger.vii. The cabmen's caught a despot, their hardships. Cabmen developed a proud identification, a mixture of gruff independence, avenue smarts, and legitimate dignity. There was once an unspoken code. Guard the fare in particular. Ladies and youngsters, comprehend your street sand, not ever admit you're lost. Don't gossip unless it benefits your fare. Support fellow drivers in fights or accidents. Maintain the horse, it's your associate and livelihood. They had been among the many few guys who moved freely between classes, neighborhoods, and ethical zones. They discovered, they persisted, they usually rarely spoke of what they saw. Eighth cab shelters and moments of respite scattered across the city had been small green huts, called cabmen's shelters, heat refuges that supplied tea, soup, and shelter from the climate. Headquartered, starting in 1875, by way of philanthropists, these huts had been no larger than a horse-drawn carriage and located near fundamental cab stands. Here, drivers would relaxation, chat, and recharge without forsaking their put-up. The foundations were strict: no alcohol, no swearing, no gambling. However, they offered camaraderie in a job that was in any other case deeply lonely. Inside of studies flowed. One cabman's ghost story would relax yet another to the bone. One more's scandalous account of a famous actor sneaking right into a brothel might draw laughter and knowing glances. These huts were greater than shelters. They had been storytelling circles, rumor mills, confession compartments. And then, when the bell rang or a customer referred to as, the driver would step out into the mist all over again, mountaineering, back into town's bloodstream. Conclusion: London's silent riders. The cadman was now not a knight, nor a hero. He used to be a wheel-turner, a watcher, a soul in the back of reins and leather gloves, guidance through a metropolis, each asleep and seething. He noticed the nice and worst of humanity. He noticed fanatics and corpses. He noticed miracles and murders, but he'd not ever blinked. He simply rode on. So the next time you suppose Victorian London at night-time, gaslights flickering, fog rolling, listen for the far-off clatter of hooves, imaged the lone figure hunched on his perch, eyes squinting by means of the darkish, ears tuned to danger, and hands wrapped tightly around the reins of the nighttime. Through gaslight, London's higher crust drank wine in candlelit parlours, and the middle class tucked their children into easy sheets. However, underneath that same dim sky, hundreds had no beds, no roof, and no relaxation. Their world used to be one of starvation, bloodless stone flooring, and the unending scrape of survival. To walk the streets of Victorian London at night time was to pass an invisible border between comfort and desperation. Beyond the carriages and club doors was once a global of shadows peopled by means of the exhausted, the exiled, and the invisible. This chapter plunges into that world. The The place dusk was not a curtain for leisure, however, a time of wandering, uncertainty, and commonly fear. A metropolis without adequate bedsby, using the mid-1800s. London had grown to be the biggest city on the earth, with over 3 million residents by means of 1860, and hundreds of thousands more pouring in from the nation-state, and abroad. Housing used to be overwhelmed. The rich extended westward, the working class squeezed into crumbling tenements, and the bad, many had nowhere at all. At night, tens of enormous quantities slept in dormitories, workhouses, public lodgings, or under the open sky. Lodging residences and houses were commonly overcrowded, filthy, and harmful. However, for many, they were the one factor standing between them and demise. With the aid of publicity, the streets of London, lit in patches by flickering gas lamps, grew to be no longer most effective a thoroughfare, but a bedroom, a refuge, and a lure to the long-established lodging residents, a mattress and a Brethofen called doss houses. These lodging corporations were essentially the most accessible, safe haven for the city's destitute and transient populations. There were hundreds and hundreds scattered during London, mainly within the East End. For a number of pence more, commonly 1 to 4, you might hire a shared room with dozens of others, more commonly with straw-stuffed mattresses or wooden planks to sleep on, a rope mattress, where guests paid a half of penny to lean throughout a taut rope strung wall to wall, sitting upright to sleep. A ground area, the place the unfortunate or poorest lay, wherever they could, in finding room between benches, below stairs, or in passageways. These residences had been notorious for their squalor. Fleas, lice, and rats were regular. Air was thick with the stench of sweat, alcohol, urine, and decay. Fights were popular. Theft used to be customary. Some lodging condominium keepers were cruel, some detached, and a few genuinely charitable, but virtually all had been overwhelmed. Yet these lodgings had been microcosms of London's nocturnal negative. Navvies, hawkers, prostitutes, discharged infantrymen, orphans, beggars, and criminals alike, jostled collectively under one damp roof, gazing one other with suspicion and silent want. 3. The workhouse at night. Time for these, with undoubtedly no approach of even a penny. The workhouse was the final lodge, administered beneath the Bad Law Amendment Act of 1834. Workhouses have been meant to be deterrents instead than sanctuaries. At night time, the surroundings used to be jail-like. Entrants were divided via intercourse, age, and families had been separated. Food used to be minimal. Beds were ordinarily wood slats or thin straw mats. Workhouses enforced strict curfew. Individual arriving too late needed to sleep outside or on the floor in stone-floored entry halls. Lights have been extinguished early. Dialogue was once discouraged. Silence was anticipated. For many, the workhouse felt like a sluggish, civil demise. The poor known as it the Bastille, but for the unwell, the historic, or the real desperate, it was once higher than loss of life within the gutter. Some came willingly within the coldest months, only for a night's warmness and a meal of gruel. Yet many chose the avenue over the foundations, disgrace, and separation of the workhouse even, supposing it meant freezing. For pavement, parks, and the Thames embankment, hundreds of thousands spent their nights wholly outside, below bridges, curled in corners beside the Thames, on the steps of public buildings, heads tucked between knees. In parks, primarily Hyde Park and Green Park, mendacity in rows like forgotten squatties, against church walls, believing God could as a minimum furnish them quiet. Some constructed makeshift shelters from crates, rags, or discarded market stalls. Others easily wandered, strolling to maintain heat, to hold their hearts beating, to preclude arrest. In winter, loss of life got here speedy. Frostbite, pneumonia, hunger. In summertime, gangs prowled the open areas, and violence flared among the desperate. Prostitution and petty theft had been frequently the one ways to survive. Yet there was once neighborhood. 2 ancient guys shared newspaper blankets. Women shared crusts of bread. Children huddled together like sparrows. The Thames embankment became a famous image of this nocturnal misery. The stone benches alongside the river were stuffed nightly with rows of sleeping terrible. Tourists came to gawk. Journalists got here to condemn. But the bad stored coming, due to the fact that there was nowhere else. The youngsters of the night. The streets teemed with abandoned, orphaned, and runaway kids, some as younger as 5. They bought matches, vegetation, or newspapers by way of day. At night time, they begged or stole. If they earned just a few pence, they would employ a rope mattress in a doss residence, or share a nook with older urchins, or else they slept in doorways or barrels. Many had been recruited into criminal gangs. Others had been preyed upon via adults. Some boys joined scuttler gangs. Some girls were forced into early prostitution. Many didn't survive youth. Disorder, abuse, and hunger had been consistent. Social reformers like Dr. Thomas Bernardo and Lord Shaftesbury created shelters and charities, but demand a long way surpassed supply. For every baby saved, a dozen were lost to the streets. The darkness was once not often kind to youngsters. It made them more difficult to see and easier to forget. Vi. Crime in the shadows of poverty desperation. Bred lawlessness. Middle of the night within the poorest quarters was a swirling mixture of risk and necessity. Persons stole to devour. Women offered themselves for a crust or a coal. Men mugged in again alleys, vanished into the fog, and lower back to sleep beside strangers in shared beds. Homicide used to be no longer exceptional, particularly for the period of disputes over coins, meals, or house. Many crimes went unreported. The victims had no one to miss them. The killers had no one to worry. Prostitutes most of the time grew to be both victim and suspect. Fallen women have been visible as corrupting influences, no longer as products of desperation. Police did little to shield them. Generally, they have been crushed and arrested by way of the very persons who have been alleged to defend the town. Despite the chaos, some lodging houses developed techniques of order and stated agreements, codes of behavior, even communal ideas, but order in these areas used to be fragile. Worry at all times slept simply underneath the floorboards. VII. Night watchers, people who located the negative journalists, social reformers, missionaries, and philanthropists made nighttime visits to slums and lodging residences. Some documented what they saw with a mixture of horror and fascination. Others supplied precise help meals, clean bedding, sermons, or authorized advice. Henry Mayhew, in his huge London Labour and the London Bad, catalogued the voices of beggars, thieves, and staff. Charles Dickens, who had once laboured in a blacking manufacturing unit as a boy, wandered the night streets to draw proposal and undergo witness. The Salvation Military, situated in 1865, sent preachers and support workers into the streets to offer soup and salvation. Some observers have been honest, others condescending, but all agreed the city's terrible had been many, had been suffering, and have been mostly unseen by way of folks that slept at the back of Lace-curtained. WINDOWSVII. I sleep as a privilege for the Victorian negative. Sleep used to be no longer assured. It was once not a ritual. It used to be now not restful. It was a transitory surrender to exhaustion. Sleep meant curling into yourself. It meant utilizing sneakers as pillows. It supposed shivering. It supposed listening for footsteps, for rats, for the dreaded method of a constable's boot. You may be moved along, overwhelmed, arrested, or easily not noted. You might sleep half a night before the rain drove you upright again. You could certainly not sleep in any respect. The reality was stark. In Victorian London, sleep used to be a luxurious. A mattress was a prize. Silence was once a dream, and warmth, that belonged to any person else. Conclusion: a metropolis divided with the aid of curtains and cobblestones as gas lamps flickered over Fleet Avenue, and fog gathered in alleys. Two Londons took form. One at the back of drawn curtains, underneath quilts, beside fires. The other, under bridges, on moist stones, with only the stars for witnesses. This was once the London the Victorians didn't place on postcards, the person who existed after nighttime, after society stopped looking, the London of the sleepless poor. And as dawn broke, the identical cabman, constables, and clerks stepped over immobile our bodies, some dwelling, some not, and the cycle started again. In the shadows forged with the aid of flickering gaslights, London's females walked a slender, unsafe route. Some chose the streets, many had no choice. Their lives were intertwined with the town's nocturnal rhythm of desperation, exploitation, resilience, and oftentimes, sudden harmony. This chapter explores the problematic and mostly tragic world of Victorian prostitution, uncovering the lives of the ladies who inhabited it, the risks they faced, the societal views that condemned them, and the fragile communities they shaped in the dark. The scale and structure of prostitution. Victorian London's population swelled swiftly in the course of the 19th century. However, financial opportunities for females have been restrained and on the whole poorly paid. Many females located themselves with few approach of support, principally widows, orphans, and people escaping abusive properties. Estimates endorse that by means of the 1880s, as many as 80,000 females labored as prostitutes in London, though specific figures are impossible to verify. Prostitution ranged from the streetwalker to the high-category courtesan. Streetwalkers had been probably the most noticeable. They plied busy thoroughfares, alleys, and corners mainly, in areas like Whitechapel, Soho, and the Strand. Brothels, more commonly run by madams, offered more discreet, however much less harmful options. Excessive class courtesans mingled with the elite, supplying companionship and discretion for a rate. Many females moved fluidly between these classes, relying on well-being, age, and luck. Middle-of-the-night work and the streets. Night used to be the area of the streetwalker. Gaslit streets have been the marketplace. The females wore modest dresses, regularly torn or patch-tanned, clung to shawls or cloaks. Many carried small purses or coin boxes. The cold of foggy nights was once a regular chance. Streetwalkers gathered in clusters close pubs, markets, and docks. They sang, joked, and exchanged know-how about police patrols or harmful purchases. However, they also guarded their territory. Fiercely fights and violence between rival ladies were original. They lived beneath the consistent threat of arrest, violence from consumers or pimps, and illness. The police in most cases arrested prostitutes beneath vague charges like loitering, public nuisance, or immoral conduct. Trials have been public and humiliating, yet many females noticed no replacement. Their work supported themselves, children, or getting older father and mother. It used to be, on the whole, the only approach to survive starvation, homelessness, or worse. The hazards of the nighttime prostitution was once perilous. Females faced violence. Assault and rape had been regular. Some purchasers were brutal, others were drunk or mentally unstable. Ailment, venereal illnesses like syphilis, ravaged many females as well-being, untreated and misunderstood. Arrest. Police harassment used to be steady, with standard raids and arrests. Exploitation. Pimps and madams controlled many ladies, taking most or all of their gains. Stigma. Society shunned prostitutes as immoral and unsafe, with little compassion for his or her plight. Many females fell into cycles of addiction, poverty, and abuse. Suicide and early dying had been tragically customary. The societal response, moral panic, and reform. Victorian society was once deeply conflicted about prostitution. On one hand, it used to be visible as a reparative evil, a safeguard, valve for male sexual want. On the other, it was a moral scourge threatening the material of society. The Contagious Ailments Acts, establishing in 1864, allowed police to detain and forcibly compare suspected prostitutes in certain districts, aiming to control venereal disease within the military and navy. These legal guidelines have been enormously controversial and deeply humiliating for women. Reformers corresponding to Josephine Butler campaigned tirelessly towards these legal guidelines and for women's rights, arguing that prostitution was often the outcomes of poverty and exploitation, no longer option. Church buildings and charities headquartered missions, properties, and rescue societies, trying to present alternatives. However, many women distrusted these efforts or determined them insufficient. The hidden lives at the back of the facade. Despite the hardships, the women of the night by and large shaped their own communities and networks. In brothels, they might share foods and stories. On the streets, they regarded out, for one, an additional warning of hazard or lending money. Some females cultivated clients who offered protection or consistent income. Others different their work with home labor, laundry, or selling small goods. Many ladies additionally dreamed of getaway by means of marriage, emigration, or respectable work. However, breakout used to be rare and fraught with challenge. Their stories were hardly ever advised, and when they had been, it used to be, most often by means of the lens of moral judgment instead than empathy. Prostitution in standard culture, and the clicking. The Victorian press sensationalized prostitution, by and large focusing on crime, scandal, and moral decay. Newspapers ran lurid stories of fallen women, mysterious murders, and secret brothels. At the same time, literature and theatre grappled with the theme, routinely sympathetically, as in Dickens's Oliver Twist or Gaskell's Mary Barton. Typically exploitatively, the figure of the prostitute grew to be a symbol for Victorian anxieties about urbanization, sexuality, and social change. The lady in the crimson scarf, the determined mother, the bloodless-hearted Madame All, were archetypes woven into the city's middle of the night. mythos.vii. The enduring legacy although Victorian London eventually moved towards legislation and reform. The legacy of these females remained elaborate. They formed the town's nocturnal culture in profound approaches canonically, socially, and culturally. Trendy historians have sought to reclaim their voices, difficult stereotypes, and highlighting resilience and company. Even at present, their studies remind us of the expenses borne with the aid of those marginalized by means of society and the complexities hidden beneath the skin of any metropolis's nightlife. Conclusion. The ladies who walked the nighttime lane, the gaslit fog, amid whispers and shadows, the females of Victorian London's night carved out an area of survival and sorrow. Their lives had been reviews of endurance in opposition to despair, dignity amid degradation, and humanity under harsh judgment. To comprehend the city's nighttime, we must do not forget them not as victims alone, however, as ladies who dared to our living, to love, and to combat at nighttime. Underneath the flickering gaslights and swirling fog of Victorian London, one other metropolis, thrived a city of shadowy alleys, whispered deals, and unspoken terror. This was once the underworld, a sprawling community of criminals, gangs, and desperate souls who made the nighttime their kingdom. In this chapter, we descend underneath the polished surface of Victorian society, getting into an international dominated with the aid of fear, cunning, and violence. We meet the criminals who stalked the night, the gangs that battled for manage, and the police who struggled to contain the town's darkish pulse. The roots of Victorian crime was formed by rapid urbanization, severe poverty, and social upheaval. As London's populace exploded, so too did possibilities and temptations for theft, violence, and vice. At night, town grew to become a looking floor for pickpockets and thieves, who designated the unwary or the good-dressed, highwaymen and burglars who took potential of darkness to rob homes and coaches, murderers and cutthroats, some running by myself, others as a part of gangs. Conmen and swindlers, who preyed on greed and ignorance. The anonymity furnished by using fog and gaslight made detection problematic. Criminals relied on networks of informants, risk-free houses, and corrupt officials. 2. The infamous gangs of the East Finish. The East Finish of London was once infamous for its dense slums and gang recreation. A couple of gangs rose to prominence. During the Victorian era, the Fenians Irish nationalist companies concerned in bombings and political violence, but additionally connected to petty crime. The Peaky Blinders. Although extra associated with early 20th century Birmingham, some legends link precursor gangs in London. The Scuttler's formative years. Gangs engaged in road fights and petty theft. The Odessians and the Birmingham Boys, concerned in safeguard rackets and smuggling. These gangs controlled territories, frequently marked by using graffiti or symbolic tattoos, and fought fiercely over markets, pubs, and brothels. They used weapons ranging from knives and brass knuckles to pistols, smuggled from overseas. Jack the Ripper and the worry that gripped London. No discussion of Victorian London's underworld could be entire without the shadow of Jack the Ripper, the unidentified killer who terrorized Whitechapel in 1888. His brutal murders of at least 5 women on the whole prostitutes shocked the general public and uncovered the city's inability to preserve its most inclined. The Ripper's reign intensified fear of the East Finish at night, leading to increased police patrols, public hysteria, and sensational press protection. Despite investigations, the killer was on no account caught, and theories about his identification persist too at the present time. For crime and corruption. Among the police, the Metropolitan Police, although extra-legitimate than prior forces, were not proof against corruption. Some officers authorized bribes from criminals, or turned a blind eye to unlawful pursuits. Others had been accused of utilizing excessive drive or fabricating evidence. Informants operated within and across the police, usually protecting gangs or focusing on opponents. This corruption elaborate efforts to manage crime and bred mistrust among London's poorer communities. The crook. Economic system crime was once almost always now not almost survival but an geared-up industry. Fencing operations purchased and offered stolen goods. Unlawful gambling dens and speakeasies operated below police tolerance or complicity. Prostitution rings have been run, like firms, smuggling moved goods, weapons, and humans inside and outside of the town. This shadow economic system thrived on secrecy and violence. Via surveillance, informants, and detectives. Detective work was evolving. The Detective Department of the Metropolitan Police, situated in 1842, used surveillance, undercover operations, and informants to combat crime. Famous detectives, both actual and fictional, captured the public creativeness. Their work was grueling and damaging, chiefly at night time. Informants had been each assets and liabilities. Their motivations ranged from self-upkeep to greed. The public's fascination and fear. Crime reviews filled newspapers, tune halls, and novels. Victorian society was simultaneously horrified and obsessed with crime, certainly violent crime at night. Public executions, sensational trials, and moralistic sermons have been spectacles that fed this fascination. This fascination influenced public coverage, policing, and the humanities. The enduring legacy of Victorian crime. The Victorian underworld formed brand New London's attitudes in the direction of crime, policing, and social inequality. It highlighted the necessity for reform, better policing, and social help. Yet it also left a legacy of fable and legend of the darkish city that by no means truly sleeps. In Victorian London, fear was as palpable because the fog rolling through the streets. At night time, town's darker facet used to be magnified, no longer just by way of gaslight and shadow. However, by way of the stories instructed, repeated, and exaggerated, fear grew to be a currency, shaping how Londoners saw themselves, their neighbours, and their metropolis. This chapter explores how worry and panic spread by way of Victorian society, how the media fueled anxieties, and the way public perception formed policies and lives within the gaslit. The anatomy of worry in Victorian London. Worry used to be a regular partner in the city's night. Worry of crime and violence, actual and imagined. Fear of disorder, lurking unseen in overcrowded slums. Worry of the unknown, the mist, the darkish alleys, the whispers. Fear of moral decay, the concept that town used to be slipping into chaos and sin. For a lot of the night represented a lack of manipulate and defense. 2. The role of the press. Sensationalism and moral panic. Newspapers flourished in Victorian London. Inexpensive penny papers sold stories that fed the general public's urge for food for scandal. Sensational headlines screamed of murders, riots, and depravity. The murders attributed to Jack the Ripper dominated front pages. Reports of fallen females and damaging immigrants stoked xenophobia and misogyny. Tales of gang violence, pickpocketing, and nighttime assaults unfold alarm. Editors ordinarily blurred fact and fiction to develop earnings. Moral reformers used the press to push agendas, emphasizing town's need for policing and social manipulate. 3. Public response. Nervousness, vigilantism, and social divides. Worry led some Londoners to preclude certain neighborhoods at nighttime, join or form vigilante agencies, patrolling streets to hold order, demand harsher legal guidelines and policing, distrust the bad, immigrants, and marginalized companies. But others sought escape in theater, literature, or church. The town was once divided no longer simply by means of wealth, but through perceptions of safeguard and chance. 4. Crime as enjoyment. Victorian society's fascination with crime was once complicated. Tune halls featured songs about thieves and murderers. Serialized novels and penny dreadfuls romanticized outlaws and detectives alike. Proper crime studies blurred traces between education and amusement. This fascination formed the tradition and influenced generations. Fear's effect on coverage and policing. Public panic forced authorities to behave. Improved police patrols in dangerous areas. Implementation of the Contagious Ailments Acts. Crackdowns on prostitution and playing. Development of early surveillance and detective work. However, these measures regularly distincted the negative and marginalized disproportionately. Fear and the urban atmosphere, urban planning and architecture reflected. Attempts to manipulate fear. Avenue lights used to be multiplied. Slums have been raised or reformed. Public spaces have been designed to decrease crime possibilities. But the city's labyrinthian streets and alleys resisted easy manage. 7. Voices of purpose and reform amid the hysteria. Some voices advised caution and compassion. Social reformers highlighted poverty and overlook as root reasons. They argued for higher housing, schooling, and healthcare as solutions. Their work laid foundations for ultra-modern city coverage. Conclusion. Fear as a drive shaping the city in Victorian London. Fear was once not just an emotion, it was once a force that shaped behavior, coverage, and culture. The town's nights have been a theatre of shadow and light, of stories told in whispers and headlines. Understanding this worry helps us see how the prior's shadows proceed to impact the gift. As darkness fell over Victorian London, town's streets would come to be a perilous position, shadowed by means of crime, desperation, and fear. But, in this nocturnal world, figures in uniform tried to preserve order. The police, nighttime, watchmen, and more than a few officials walked the skinny line between enforcing the regulation and navigating a society marked by means of deep inequality. This chapter delves into the evolving function of law enforcement within the Victorian night, its challenges, corruption, innovations, and the tricky relationship between officers and the communities they served. Origins and constitution of Victorian policing. The Metropolitan Police Carrier, founded in 1829 by means of Sir Robert Peel, used to be the first modern police drive on the earth. Designed to be a reputable, disciplined body, it sought to switch the chaotic and most often violent approach of watchmen and constables. With the aid of the Victorian era, the force had grown extensively. Policing was divided between uniformed officers, detectives, and specialized items. Night shifts posed distinct challenges, requiring vigilance amid darkness and social unrest. 2. The night watchmen and their declinelia than the Met Police. Night watchmen have been groupie-pointed volunteers who patrolled neighborhoods after dark. They carried lanterns and bells to alert residents. Their duties have been restrained and probably ineffective. Through the mid-19th century, reliable police replaced most watchmen. Nonetheless, some watchmen endured, peculiarly in rural or suburban areas, symbolizing the town's wrestle to adapt to modernization. 3. Challenges of nighttime. Night policing used to be complex due to poor lights. Gasoline lamps supplied restrained visibility. Fog, additional decreased sight. Threat. Officers confronted violence from criminals and drunken crowds. Limited manpower. Large, sprawling districts intended officers had been in general remoted. Public mistrust. Many saw police as oppressive or corrupt. Notably in poor areas, authorized constraints. Officers had fewer powers than in these days, relying closely on witnesses and confession. Despite this, nighttime policing was once important to public safety, for famous circumstances and policing. At night, many infamous crimes befell at night, trying out the police's effectiveness. The Jack the Ripper investigations uncovered police barriers and public frustration. Raids on brothels, gambling dens, and opium residences had been pursuits, however, fraught with hazard. Police probably clashed with gangs and faced challenges infiltrating criminal networks. These instances influenced police systems and public notion. Police corruption and public criticism. Whilst many officers have been dedicated, corruption was once a major hassle. Some took bribes or included criminals. Others abused their authority, particularly towards the poor. Scandals regularly erupted. Unsafe trust. Reform efforts sought to professionalize and clean the force, with mixed success. Innovations and reforms. Victorian policing saw giant innovations. The construction of the detective branch in 1842, introduction of forensic techniques, including fingerprinting late 19th century, development of the police field as a communique software, coaching upgrades and standardized uniforms. These alterations helped the police turn out to be extra robust, mainly at nighttime. The relationship between police and group police had a tricky relationship with London's diverse communities on wealthier areas. Police had been respected and welcomed. In poorer districts, specifically in the East Finnish, officers have been in general feared or resented. efforts to build, believe, integrated community outreach and social programs, but limitations of sophistication, ethnicity, and poverty by and large hindered cooperation. 8. The dead night economic system of regulation. Enforcement policing used to be a part of a broader process that included nighttime courts, where offences dedicated after darkish have been tried, prisons and lockups, where suspects awaited trial or punishment, coroners, and medical examiners who investigated deaths, chiefly suspicious ones. These institutions shaped the nighttime's legal panorama. Conclusion. Guardians in a city of shadows. Victorian London's police and nighttime watchmen faced big challenges, working in a metropolis riddled with risk, poverty, and fear. Their efforts were imperfect, however, foundational to modern law enforcement in the gaslit streets. Their presence was a reminder that even in darkness, society sought order. As darkness blanketed Victorian London, town did not fall silent. Rather, one more variety of life awakened, one among commerce, conversation, and group. Night markets buzzed with recreation, taverns overflowed with purchasers, and the alternative goods and ideas flourished beneath the gaslit sky. This chapter explores the colourful, in many instances chaotic world of Victorian London's night-time economic climate, how markets, pubs, and street carriers shaped the city's character after dusk. The rise of night markets. Victorian London's working lessons relied closely on nighttime markets to purchase cheap goods after long days of labour. Markets such as Smithfield meat, Bermondsey fish, and Spitalfields produce operated late into the night or early morning. Carriers offered contemporary and preserved foods, household objects, and apparel. The markets had been loud, crowded, and pungent, stuffed with shouting merchants, bargaining purchasers, and the sounds of horses and carts. Nighttime markets served now not just commerce, however social interaction areas. The place news used to be exchanged, offers have been struck, and neighbourhood ties strengthened. 2. The position of taverns and public residences. Taverns and pubs have been the heartbeat of Victorian nightlife. Hundreds and hundreds dotted town, from grand enterprises in the west, finished to cramped cellars within the east. Finish. Taverns provided ale, spirits, food, and companionship. They served as casual meeting areas for workers, tradesmen, politicians, and criminals alike. Many pubs hosted track, dancing, playing, and theatrical performances. The atmosphere ranged from convivial to rowdy, on the whole depending on the local and clientele. 3. The intersection of commerce and crime. A middle of the night commerce repeatedly blurred into illegality. Black markets thrived, selling stolen items, counterfeit cash, and illicit resources like opium and absinthe. Playing dens, most often hidden within pubs or back rooms, operated beneath the radar. Prostitution was once ordinarily linked to tavern culture, with brothels or bawdy residences local. Legislation enforcement struggled to manipulate these routines without disrupting reliable business. 4. Street carriers and the informal financial system. Street carriers were primary to the nighttime financial system. They sold snacks, newspapers, plant life, and small items to passers-by. Many operated without licenses, risking fines or confiscation. Carriers customarily labored in complicated stipulations and covered to climate, competition, and harassment. Despite hardships, avenue vending supplied imperative sales for the urban terrible and brought vibrancy to the town's streets. The influence of industrialization and technological know-how. Industrialization converted nocturnal commerce, gasoline lighting fixtures, elevated trade hours, increased transportation, allowed goods to arrive later and be sold at night. Factories operated in shifts, growing demand for nighttime offerings and supplies. Yet industrialization also intensified social divides, with wealthier courses taking flight from the noisy markets and taverns. Cultural and social significance. Time markets and taverns had been greater than fiscal spaces. They were social hubs. They fostered a sense of community amongst staff. They allowed for the alternative strategies and political dialogue. They mirrored and shaped town's multicultural makeup, with immigrants contributing foods, song, and customs. The town's night economy used to be a residing respiratory, a part of Victorian life. 7. Risks and regulations. Authorities attempted to keep watch over nighttime commerce. Licensing laws managed tavern opening hours. Market laws sought to ensure meals, safeguard and fair trading. Police monitored for illegal movements. Nevertheless, enforcement used to be uneven, and many vendors and corporations operated in a grey discipline. Conclusion: commerce that never sleeps. Victorian London. Night markets and taverns were crucial organs within the metropolis's physical source of sustenance, entertainment, and social connection. In the gaslit fog, amid the clatter of carts and the murmur of voices, the town's pulse quickened to live, restless and without end complex. No photograph captures Victorian London at nighttime without the enduring elements of swirling fog and flickering gaslights, symbols as much of mystery and risk as of progress and modernity. These atmospheric stipulations formed how persons experienced the city, influencing temper, habits, and the town's very identification. On this final chapter, we explore how fog and gaslight outlined Victorian London's nights, both physically and culturally developing an environment charged with magnificence, hazard, and imagination. The origins and nature of London fog. London's famous fog, regularly called pea-soupers, used to be a result of typical climate stipulations combined with excessive urban pollution. Smoke from coal fires combined with moist air, growing thick, yellowish fog. Fog was extra commonplace in less warm months but could arise circular. Visibility was frequently diminished to mere toes, making navigation complicated and damaging. Fog grew to be both a literal and metaphorical veil over town. To gaslighting the streets, a new city science, the introduction of fuel lighting fixtures in the early 19th century revolutionized London's NIGHTSCAPE. Fuel lamps changed oil lamps and candles, delivering steadier, brighter, mild. The first fuel avenue lamps seemed in the 1807, however well-known adoption grew by way of the 1830s and past. Gaslight allowed for longer working hours, safer streets, and nightlife enlargement. Nevertheless, gaslight also forged eerie shadows, revealing some areas and plunging others into deeper darkness. 3. The dance of sunshine and shadow. The interplay of gaslight and fog created an ever-moving visual landscape. Gasoline lamps glowed halos within the mist, blurring outlines and distorting shapes. Shadows lengthened and moved unpredictably, feeding fears of lurking dangers. Streets could appear each inviting and dangerous, gorgeous and sinister. This atmosphere used to be a breeding ground for imagination, superstition, and storytelling. IV. Psychological and social effects. The fog and gaslight formed how Londoners felt and behaved at nighttime. The obscured vision heightened anxiousness and suspicion. Men and women hurried to prevent darkened alleys. Crime was once harder to realize, but in addition, extra feared. The fog's muffling result multiplied the sense of isolation or neighborhood, depending on context. The atmosphere each hid and printed the city's hidden truth, fog, and gaslight in Victorian tradition. Writers and poets have been captivated via London's fog and gaslight. Charles Dickens described fog as a character itself in his novels. Artwork captured the luminous glow and thriller of the streets. Sensation novels and detective stories used the atmosphere to construct anxiety. Fog and gaslight became metaphors for moral ambiguity, risk, and transformation. Public well-being and environmental issues. The Indent fog had deadly penalties. The mixture of smoke and fog brought on respiratory problems. Episodes of smog resulted in hundreds and hundreds of deaths. Specifically, among the negative, attention grew toward the end of the Victorian generation about air pollutions have an effect on. Efforts to scale down coal smoke would handest acquire traction within the 20th century. 7. The legacy of Victorian night atmosphere in these days. The photo of fog-shrouded, gaslit Victorian London endures in trendy creativeness. It symbolizes a metropolis caught between darkness and lightweight. It displays the tensions of development and peril. It invitations us to take into account how environment shapes human experience. The gaslit fog remains a strong icon of Victorian nighttime. Conclusion. Light in the mist of fog and gaslights of Victorian London were more than climate and technological know-how. They have been forces that shaped the very soul of town at night. Of their glow and gloom, fear and fascination mingled, creating a cityscape as haunting as it was alive. As we shut this exploration, we bear in mind that every shadow tells a narrative, and, in Victorian London, those reviews have been written in gaslight and mist.